What happens when a president who has spent years fighting his legal battles all the way to the Supreme Court suddenly runs out of doors to knock on? That may be exactly what Donald Trump is facing right now. The Supreme Court has once again refused to step in and erase a major civil judgment against Trump. And this wasn't some obscure procedural dispute. It involved a $5 million verdict in the Jean Carroll case, where a jury found Trump liable for sexually abusing Carroll and defaming her. And now, after another attempt to get the Supreme Court to intervene, the justices have said no. No explanation, no rescue, no new hearing, just a denial. Reuters reports that the Supreme Court rejected Trump's latest request on August 17, 2026, leaving the earlier verdict standing. But here's where this story gets much bigger than one courtroom victory or one legal bill. Because Trump has repeatedly relied on the courts to fight, delay, appeal, and challenge decisions against him. And this time, America's highest court has effectively told him the case is staying where it is. So what exactly happened? Why did Trump's Supreme Court strategy fail? And what does this tell us about the limits of presidential power even for Donald Trump? Let's break it down. The ruling that Trump couldn't escape to understand why this matters. We have to go back to the original Carroll case. Jean Carroll accused Trump of sexually assaulting her in the 1990s and later defaming her when he publicly denied her allegations. Trump denied the allegations and fought the case aggressively. But in 2023, a federal jury reached a verdict. The jury found Trump liable for sexually abusing Carroll and defaming her. The award was approximately $5 million. And importantly, this was a civil case, not a criminal conviction. That distinction matters. A civil jury verdict is about legal liability and damages. It does not mean Trump was criminally convicted of a sexual offense. But legally, the verdict was still a serious defeat. Trump appealed. And when that failed, his lawyers continued trying to get higher courts involved. Eventually, the case reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declined to hear Trump's challenge. That alone was significant. But Trump wasn't finished. His legal team later asked the Supreme Court to reconsider, and on August 17th, the court rejected that request as well. The Supreme Court's order did not provide an explanation. And that's normal for this kind of denial. But the practical consequence is straightforward. The $5 million verdict remains in place. Carroll has already collected approximately $5.63 million when interest is included, according to Reuters. And suddenly, a legal battle that has been running for years has reached another major endpoint. Why the Supreme Court's no matters now. Here's something viewers should understand. When the Supreme Court refuses to hear a case, it isn't necessarily saying, "We agree with every word of the lower court's decision." That's not how the process works. The court accepts only a fraction of the cases that come before it. But in Trump's situation, the significance comes from the fact that his team had already gone through multiple levels of litigation, and the Supreme Court has now declined to provide another avenue for overturning this particular $5 million judgment. That matters because Trump's legal strategy has often depended on keeping disputes alive through appeals and procedural challenges. The longer a case continues, the more opportunities lawyers have to challenge rulings, seek stays, raise constitutional arguments, or ask higher courts to intervene. But eventually, there is a point where the legal system says, enough. And that is the point Trump appears to have reached in this particular case. The Supreme Court has closed another door. And that creates an important contrast with the enormous power Trump has exercised in other areas of his presidency. Because the president can issue executive orders, he can direct federal agencies, he can appoint judges, he can shape national policy. But that does not mean every legal judgment disappears simply because the defendant happens to be president. And that distinction is becoming increasingly important during Trump's second term. This isn't the only time Trump has hit a courtroom wall. Here's where the story gets even more interesting. If you only followed one Supreme Court case, you might think this was an isolated event. It isn't. Trump's second term has produced a steady stream of major legal battles involving presidential authority. Some decisions have gone Trump's way, others have not. And the Supreme Court itself has delivered a mixed record. For example, in June, the court expanded presidential authority over the removal of officials at independent agencies in a major decision involving Federal Trade Commission Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter. That was a major win for Trump. But the same Supreme Court has also rejected Trump's attempt to immediately fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. And earlier this year, the court ruled that Trump's sweeping tariffs could not be imposed under the emergency powers law his administration relied upon. The consequences of that tariff ruling were enormous. The administration has since been forced to refund tens of billions of dollars in tariff collections, with Reuters reporting roughly $100 billion in refunds as of August. So the bigger picture isn't Trump always loses at the Supreme Court. He doesn't. And it isn't, Trump always wins, he doesn't. The bigger story is that the court is not functioning as a guaranteed escape hatch for every Trump legal problem. Sometimes Trump wins. Sometimes Trump loses. And sometimes the court simply says, we're not taking the case. That's exactly what happened again in the Carroll litigation. And this brings us to a much bigger constitutional question. How much power does a president actually have? Trump's second term has generated intense arguments over executive authority. His administration has pushed aggressively against lower court rulings, challenged limits on presidential power, and sought emergency intervention from the Supreme Court in multiple disputes. According to Ballotpedia's tracking of Supreme Court emergency applications, there had been dozens of applications connected to the Trump administration by mid-August 2026. That tells you something about the scale of the legal battle surrounding this presidency. But the Constitution creates separate branches of government for a reason. Congress makes laws. The executive branch enforces them, and courts determine what the law requires when disputes arise. The president does not get to simply declare a legal judgment invalid because he disagrees with it. And Trump's repeated encounters with the courts demonstrate the tension between political power and judicial authority. That tension is especially visible right now in another Supreme Court dispute involving Trump's controversial White House ballroom project. The administration asked the Supreme Court to allow construction of the approximately $400 million ballroom to continue while its appeal proceeds. The project has already faced lower court challenges over whether the administration had the necessary congressional authorization and complied with historic preservation requirements. That case is still developing, and it is important not to confuse it with the Carroll case. But together, these disputes illustrate the larger battle. How far can a president go before the courts say no? And increasingly, that question is being tested in real time. The Carroll case is different, and that's important. There's another reason this Supreme Court decision deserves attention. The Carroll case isn't fundamentally about presidential policy. It's not about immigration. It's not about tariffs. It's not about executive orders. It's a civil case involving Trump's conduct and statements. That makes it a very different kind of legal problem. Trump's lawyers have attempted to connect the broader legal dispute to questions surrounding presidential immunity. But the civil nature of the Carroll litigation creates important distinctions. The Supreme Court's landmark 2024 presidential immunity decision dealt with criminal prosecution of former presidents and distinguished between official and unofficial conduct. Civil liability is a different legal question. And in the Carroll litigation, Trump's attempts to use the Supreme Court to overturn the $5 million judgment have now faced another rejection. In other words, the Supreme Court has not created a blanket rule saying that being president makes Trump immune from every civil consequence. That's a crucial distinction, because one of the biggest misunderstandings in modern American politics is the idea that presidential power is unlimited. It isn't. Even presidents operate inside a constitutional system, and when courts enforce legal boundaries, political power cannot simply erase the ruling. But don't leave yet, because there is another important piece of the Carroll litigation that people could easily miss. The $5 million judgment is not the only Carroll-related case involving Trump. There is also a separate $83.3 million defamation verdict, and Trump's lawyers have asked the Supreme Court to review that case as well. Reuters reported that the Supreme Court was still considering whether to hear Trump's appeal of that larger judgment. So, while the Supreme Court's latest denial is a major development, it does not mean every legal dispute between Trump and Carroll has been resolved. That's an important distinction. The $5 million case has suffered another Supreme Court setback, but the $83.3 million dispute remains a separate legal battle. And that means Trump's broader fight with Carroll is not necessarily over. This is exactly why careful reporting matters. A headline saying, "Trump loses at Supreme Court," can be accurate in a general sense, but it doesn't tell viewers which case was rejected, what judgment remains in place, or which separate appeal may still be pending. The details matter, and in a politically explosive environment, the details matter more than ever. Now, let's step back from the courtroom, because there is a political dimension to this. Trump built much of his political identity around fighting institutions that he believes are working against him. He has repeatedly portrayed legal challenges as political attacks. His supporters often see these cases as examples of a broader effort to undermine him. His critics see them as evidence that powerful political figures should not receive special treatment. And that debate isn't going away. But here's the uncomfortable reality for everyone involved. Courts don't operate according to campaign slogans. A judge doesn't get to rewrite a verdict because one political party is angry. And the Supreme Court doesn't exist to guarantee victory for one president. That is why this latest decision can matter beyond the Carroll case itself. It reinforces a basic principle. Trump can fight, Trump can appeal. Trump can ask the Supreme Court to intervene. But he cannot force the Supreme Court to give him the outcome he wants. And when the justices refuse to hear the challenge, the lower court judgment remains. That's not necessarily a political statement. It's the legal system functioning through its normal procedures. And that may actually be the most important lesson in this entire story. Look at where we are. Trump is currently confronting legal battles involving presidential power, tariffs, voting rules, federal officials, immigration policy, presidential projects, and personal civil judgments. Some of those battles have produced victories, some have produced defeats, and some are still unfolding. The Supreme Court itself has sometimes expanded Trump's executive authority while rejecting other attempts by his administration. That means anyone claiming the court is simply Trump's rubber stamp is ignoring decisions that have gone against him. At the same time, anyone claiming Trump has been completely shut down by the judiciary would also be ignoring the major victories his administration has received. The reality is more complicated, and that's exactly what makes the latest Carroll decision so interesting. Trump went to the nation's highest court, asking for another opportunity to challenge the $5 million verdict. The court declined. There was no dramatic courtroom speech, no televised confrontation, no explosive opinion, just a short order. But sometimes, the quietest decisions have the clearest consequences. Because when the Supreme Court refuses to reopen a case, the practical message is simple. The judgment stands. So, is this the end of Trump's legal battles? Absolutely not. In fact, if anything, the coming months could bring even more consequential fights over presidential power. The White House ballroom case is still developing. The separate $83.3 million Carroll appeal remains a different matter. And Trump's administration continues to push major legal questions through the federal courts. But the latest Supreme Court decision sends an unmistakable reminder. There are limits to presidential power. There are limits to appeals. And there are limits to how many times a legal battle can be reopened. Trump has spent years fighting his way through the courts. This time, America's highest court simply declined to give him another chance in this particular case. And whether you support Trump or oppose him, that's the part worth watching. Because the biggest constitutional question of this era may not be whether one president can win every legal battle. It may be whether the American system can continue forcing every president to operate within legal boundaries. And that question is far from settled. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think the Supreme Court made the right call by refusing Trump's latest attempt to overturn the Carroll judgment? Or should the justices have taken up the case? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want clear, fact-based coverage of the biggest political and legal battles coming out of Washington, make sure you're subscribed, because this fight is nowhere near over. And the next Supreme Court decision could be even bigger.